What would you do if the only thing your father left you in this world was a tower everyone in the village said should have been pulled down 20 years ago? In Pine Hollow, a young woman named Elizabeth Walker, only 24 years old, inherited from her late father one collapsing stone tower, a rusted key, and a debt no bank would forgive. The village laughed. The solicitor apologized. But what waited inside a room that appeared on no plan, in no ledger, in no memory that anyone would admit to, that would change the shape of her life entirely? So settle in, wherever you are watching from tonight, and stay close, for this story is a slow one, and the best of it lies past the first cold turning. The coach set Elizabeth down at the edge of Pine Hollow just before dusk, in a thin November drizzle that seemed to have been falling for weeks. She stepped into the mud with her one small trunk beside her, and watched the driver flick his reins and disappear along the lane without a backward glance. The village lay ahead, in a low huddle of slate roofs and smoking chimneys, the church spire dark against a pale, exhausted sky. Rooks were coming home to the elms. Somewhere, a dog barked once, and then thought better of it. She had not stood in Pine Hollow for 11 years, not since she was a thin, watchful child of 13, sent away to a distant aunt after her mother's fever had carried the household off in one wet spring. Her father had stayed behind. Her father had always stayed behind. Now her father was 3 weeks in the earth of the parish churchyard, and she had come to bury what remained of him properly, in her own way, and to see what he had left her. She had been told, in a letter written in the crabbed hand of a country solicitor, that the estate was small. Small was a generous word for it. There was no house, there was no cottage, there were no coins in a strongbox, and no cattle in a field. There was only the tower on the hill above the village, half fallen already when she was a child, and the debts owed against it, which came to more than she had ever seen written down in one place. Elizabeth lifted her trunk, with a hand reddened by the cold, and set out along the lane. Her boots had been mended twice at the toes, and the seam of her cloak had opened again at the shoulder. She did not stop to fix it. She had learned, in the years away, that grief moved best when the body kept moving with it. She kept her eyes on the road, and let the drizzle do what it liked with her face. At the fork below the church, she paused. To the right lay the village proper, warm windows, and the smell of bread and coal smoke. To the left, the lane climbed through wet hedgerows toward the ridge where the tower stood, black against the last gray of the sky. She had not eaten since morning. She was cold to the bone. She turned left. The solicitor's office sat above the saddler's shop, up a narrow stair that groaned beneath her weight. Mr. Harrow was a lean, gray man, with ink on his cuffs, and a kindness he tried to keep hidden behind a professional stiffness. He rose when she entered, and offered her the chair nearest the small fire, and for that alone she was grateful. "You are Miss Walker," he said. "I am," she replied. He drew a thin bundle of papers from a drawer, and laid it on the desk between them. "Your father's affairs," he murmured, "were not tidy." She had expected that. She waited. "There is the tower," Mr. Harrow went on, "and the parcel of ground it stands upon. Some 3 acres, mostly bracken. There is a small sum owed to the village, for unpaid rates. There is a larger sum owed to a private lender in the town of Merrifield. There is nothing else." "Nothing else," Elizabeth repeated. "Nothing." He hesitated, then added, more gently, "He was offered, several times, to sell the tower for its stone. He refused each offer. I could not persuade him otherwise. He was attached to the place." She let that word sit between them. Attached. It was a word for barnacles and burrs, for things that clung without reason. She thought of her father's silence at their last parting, his hand on the top of her head, and the way he had turned back toward the ridge before her coach was even out of sight. "May I see it?" she asked. "Tonight?" Mr. Harrow looked toward the window. "The light is nearly gone." "I would rather see it in the dark," she said, "than lie awake wondering what it looks like." He did not argue. He wrapped the papers, added a folded map of the parcel, and drew from a locked drawer a single heavy iron key wrapped in oilskin. He set it in her palm as though it were a living thing. "Your father gave this to me the day he took ill," he said. "He said, if the day came, it was to go to no one but you. Not to the lender, not to the village, to you alone." She closed her hand around the key. It was colder than the room. Outside, the church bells struck the half-hour, and in that thin bronze sound she felt, for the first time since the letter had reached her, that something in Pine Hollow was waiting. By the time she reached the foot of the ridge, the last light had gone, and the drizzle had turned to a fine, needling rain. The tower rose above her out of the hedgerows, like a broken tooth, 3 stories, where once there had been 4. Its upper courses tumbled down the slope in a long gray scree of stone. Ivy had eaten one whole side. A jackdaw's nest sat blackly in the topmost window. The door at the base was oak, blackened by weather, banded with iron, and warped inward at the hinge. Elizabeth set down her trunk. She stood a long moment in the rain, looking up at the thing her father had refused to sell for stone. It did not look like an inheritance. It looked like a punishment. It looked like the last argument in a long, wordless quarrel between a father and the world. Behind her, she heard the crunch of boots on wet gravel. 2 men were coming up the lane from the village, lanterns swinging, and behind them a 3rd figure in a heavy coat she already, somehow, recognized. The loudest voice in Pine Hollow, come to watch her fail. She squared her shoulders and turned to face them. Was it foolish, do you think, to keep a ruin no one else wanted? Or was her father hiding something in those stones that the whole village had walked past for a lifetime? If a story like this holds you, leave a small word below, and stay near us, for the room Elizabeth is about to find was drawn on no plan she or anyone else had ever seen. The lanterns came up first, then the men, and then the coat, which was heavy dark wool, cut broad at the shoulder, and belted at the waist with brass. Mr. Bramwell of the mill was a wide man, with a wide face, and his voice carried down a lane, the way weather did. "So it's true," he said. "Walker's girl. Come for her fortune." The 2 men with him laughed obligingly. Elizabeth said nothing. Rain ran off the brim of her bonnet and darkened the shoulder of her cloak where the seam had opened. 11 years gone, Bramwell said, and back for this. He lifted his lantern toward the tower, and the yellow light climbed the wet stone and found nothing to hold. 3 acres of bracken, a heap of falling rock. Half the parish thought he'd pull it down himself before the end. He did not, Elizabeth said. No, he did not. Bramwell stepped closer, and the light caught the shine of rain on his cheek. I offered him fair coin for the stone. Twice. He turned me from his door both times, and him owing my brother in Merrifield a sum that would settle a man for life. He smiled without warmth. Now you'll settle it, I suppose. Or the lender will settle it for you. I have the key, Elizabeth said. You have a key to a ruin, miss. That is not the same. One of the men behind him coughed into his fist to cover a laugh. Word had already gone through the lower cottages. She had seen it in the way curtains twitched as she passed, in the way a woman drawing water at the pump had straightened to look, and then bent again without a greeting. Pine Hollow had made up its mind before her boots reached the ridge. Old Walker's daughter, come home to bury her name in her father's debt. a thin thing in a mended cloak, standing in the rain by a tower half fallen down. "Sell it to me," Bramwell said, and his voice softened into something worse than mockery. "Tonight, as it stands, I will settle the rates with the vestry before Sunday, and give you enough besides to take a coach south and never see this hill again. Your father was a stubborn man. You needn't be." Elizabeth looked at him a long moment. The rain fell between them. "No," she said. Bramwell's mouth thinned. He gave a short nod, as though a thing he had suspected had been proven. "Then you'll learn what he learned," he said. "Sleep well in it, miss. The wind comes hard off the ridge." He turned, and the lanterns turned with him, and the three of them went back down the lane the way they had come, their light diminishing between the hedgerows until it was only a wet glow, and then nothing. Elizabeth stood a moment more with her hand on the iron ring of the door. She did not weep. She had used those tears 11 years ago, and had not found more since. Then, from the hedge at her elbow, a voice spoke that she had not heard approach. "Child." An old woman stood on the lane, small under an oilskin hood, a basket over one arm. Her face was seamed like a walnut, and her eyes were pale and very steady. Elizabeth did not know her, or thought she did not, until some old memory shifted and offered up a name, Mrs. Ainsley, who had kept hens at the low end of the parish when Elizabeth was a child, and had once given her a warm egg wrapped in a cloth. "Your father set his lamp in that window every night for 11 years, the old woman said. "Mind you learn why, before you mind the rest." She did not wait for an answer. She turned and went on down the lane with her basket, and the drizzle closed behind her, and Elizabeth was alone again, with the door and the rain and the sound of her own breath. She fitted the iron key to the lock. It turned stiffly, protesting, and the warped door gave inward with a slow groan of hinges that had not been opened in weeks. A breath of cold air came out to meet her, smelling of stone and damp wool, and, faintly, of extinguished tallow. She lifted her trunk over the sill and stepped inside. The ground floor of the tower was a single round room. Her lantern, once she had struck a light from the tinderbox she carried in her cloak, showed her a swept flag floor, a small iron stove set into the far wall, a plain wooden table, one chair, a narrow cot with a folded blanket, a shelf of tin plates, and a low shelf of books whose spines had softened with damp. There was no ruin here. There was only poverty, kept neat. Above her, a wooden stair curled up along the inside wall to a trap in the ceiling. She did not climb it that night. She was too tired, and the rain on the stones outside was steady, and there was a stub of candle in a tin dish on the table that would have been left by no one but him. She lit the stub. She sat in the chair. She ate a piece of bread from the paper twist in her trunk and drank rainwater from a tin cup off the shelf. Then she lay down on the cot in her cloak and boots, because the blanket did not smell of anyone she remembered, and she listened. The tower spoke all night. Wind moved in the upper courses and drew a low note from somewhere higher, a sound like a jug being blown across the mouth. Water ran down a channel in the stone behind her head and out under the sill. A stone somewhere in the wall settled with a small dry click. The jackdaws in the topmost window shifted and were quiet and shifted again. She thought of the old woman's words. She thought of the lamp in the window. She thought of her father alone here for 11 years, while she grew tall in another county and forgot his face. Toward the small hours she slept and dreamed of nothing, and woke at gray first light with the taste of iron in her mouth. The rain had stopped. A single thin bar of pale sun had come in at the seam of the door and lay across the flag floor like a laid rule. She rose, stiff and cold, and made herself stand a moment in that thin light and take account. It was a ruin. Bramwell was not wrong about that. The upper story she had not yet seen would be worse. There was no coin. There was debt in Merrifield, and rates due at the vestry, and no field, no cow, no trade. She had a key, a cot, a stub of candle, and a shelf of books gone soft with damp. But her father had set a lamp in a window every night for 11 years, and a woman who had once given her a warm egg had come out into the rain to tell her so. Elizabeth set her hand flat on the cold stone of the wall, as if to feel a pulse in it, and something in her, thin and stubborn and long shut, answered back. She stood a long while with her hand on the wall before she moved. Then she pushed the door wider to let the thin sun in and climbed the wooden stair. The treads were sound under her boots, though the pegs at the joints had darkened with age. The trap at the top was fitted with a plain iron ring. She lifted it and set it back against the floor above and went up into the second story. It was a single round room like the one below, with 2 narrow windows set deep in the stone and a low iron grate in the far wall. Dust lay on the floor in a smooth pale film. A table stood under one window with a tin lamp on it, its glass sooted, its wick trimmed. A chair sat pushed back from the table, as if a man had risen from it not long before. On the sill beside the lamp were 3 small stones set in a row, and beside them a chip of red brick that did not belong in a tower built of grey. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and looked at the brick and did not touch it. She crossed to the window and set her palm on the sill. The sill was worn in one place to a soft hollow, the size of the heel of a hand pressed down night after night. That was where the lamp had stood. She looked out and saw the village below, the church tower, the mill, the lane climbing between hedgerows. Any lamp set in this window would be seen from half the parish. She turned back to the room and began to pace it. The outer curve of the tower she knew from walking round it in the rain. The inner curve of the room felt smaller than it should. She counted her steps from the stair to the grate, and from the grate to the second window, and from the second window back to the stair. Then she went down and counted the same steps below. The count was not the same. Below was longer, by 3 paces. Above was shorter by 3 paces on the north side, where the wall stood thick between the grate and the head of the stair. She sat down on the top tread and looked at that wall a long time. Stone walls in old towers were thick. She knew that. A hearth swallowed depth. She knew that too. But 3 paces was 3 paces, and a hearth was not 3 paces deep. She did not rise and knock on the wall. She did not fetch a tool. She only sat and looked, and set the thing quietly aside in her mind, the way a woman sets a strange coin aside on a shelf to think about later. A small sound came from below. She rose and went down. In the open door stood a thin gray cat with a white throat, sides drawn in tight, one ear notched. It did not run when she came near. It looked up at her, and then past her into the room, as if it had been in and out of this door many times, and only wanted to know whether it might come again. Elizabeth broke the last of her bread, and set half of it on the flagstones inside the sill. The cat came in on soft feet, ate, sat, and began to wash one paw. Elizabeth watched it and did not speak. Somewhere outside a rook called once. The bar of pale sun had moved a hand's breadth across the floor. She thought of the 3 paces and the chip of red brick on the sill above, and did not yet know what either of them meant. That day she began to work. She went down into the village at mid-morning, with the rusted iron key in her pocket, and her cloak pinned at the shoulder over the open seam. At the vestry, she gave her name to a clerk, who did not lift his eyes, and paid a small part of the rates from the coins she had left after the coach, enough to show intent, not enough to settle. At the ironmonger's she bought a stiff broom, a scrubbing brush, a pound of yellow soap, a tin of tallow, and a small hand axe with a mended haft, all at prices that took most of what remained. The ironmonger, a broad man with soot in the creases of his hands, weighed her coin without comment and set the goods on the counter in a neat row. At the door, she almost walked into a man coming in. He stopped and looked at her, and then broke into a slow, surprised smile. He was near her father's age, with a grizzled beard and a coat gone at the elbow. His name was Mr. Pendry, and he had carted turnips for her father when Elizabeth was a child. He said her name once, quietly, and touched his cap. He asked where she was staying. She said the Tower. He looked at her goods on the counter, and at the mended haft of the axe, and said he had a barrow at the yard, and would carry them up for her. She thanked him. He said it was nothing. He walked with her up the lane and did not fill the walk with talk. At the door of the Tower, he set the barrow down and looked up along the ivy and said only, "He kept it swept." Then he left her at the sill and went down again, refusing the coin she tried to press on him. She began at the ground floor. She swept the flagstones till the broom whispered on bare stone. She scrubbed the table and the chair and the shelf of tin plates with yellow soap and rainwater, warmed on the little iron stove. She took the damp softened books down, one by one, and stood them open on the hearth to dry. Most were common enough: a book of sermons, a farrier's manual, a battered volume of Cowper. But one was a thin ledger, bound in brown cloth, its pages ruled in her father's neat, slanting hand. Dates, weights, small sums. She set it aside on the table without opening it further, and went back to the wall. The cat stayed. It slept on the folded blanket in the sun, and rose when she rose, and followed her up the stair, and sat by the grate while she scrubbed the upper floor. She began to speak to it once or twice a day, in single words. Move. Good. Come. It came. By the end of the second day, her hands were raw, and her back ached in a low, steady line from the base of her neck to her hip. She slept hard and dreamed of scrubbing. On the third day, she cleared the yard, cutting back bracken with the small axe, dragging fallen stones into a heap against the north side. Under the bracken, she found the base of what had once been a lean-to, and in the base of the lean-to, a shallow rectangle of set brick, red brick, the same color as the chip on the sill above. She stood over the brick a long while, wiping her hands on her apron. Then she went inside and up the stair, and stood again in the upper room, and paced from the stair to the grate, and from the grate to the second window, and the count came out 3 paces short, on the north side, the same side under which the red brick lay in the yard. She did not fetch a tool. She went down and put her hand flat on the north wall inside the ground floor room, and knocked once with her knuckles. The sound was dull. She moved a hand's breadth to the left, and knocked again. Dull. She moved to the right of the grate and knocked. Hollow. Only a hair. Only a change a woman scrubbing would feel more than hear. But hollow. The cat came in from the yard and pressed once against her knee, and sat by her boot. Elizabeth stood with her hand on the stone, and did not smile, but something in her mouth eased, that had been set since the coach. She fetched the small hand axe and the scrubbing brush, and a length of the sacking Mr. Pendry had left folded in the barrow. She did not swing at the wall. She knelt instead, and cleared the plaster at the foot of the stone with the brush, working the yellow soap into the seams, until the mortar showed through in a long, soft line. The mortar there was not the same as the mortar elsewhere. Elsewhere it was hard gray lime, pitted with age. Here it was softer, browner, laid in a narrower joint, and it crumbled at the pressure of her thumb. She worked with the brush, and then with the flat of the axe, easing, never striking. A stone came free in her hands. It was no larger than a loaf of bread. Behind it was darkness and a breath of colder air. Elizabeth set the stone down on the flag floor and fetched the lantern. She loosened a second stone, and a third. The cat watched from the folded blanket, with its paws tucked under its chest. By the time the fourth stone lay on the floor, the opening was the height of a child and the width of a shoulder. She held the lantern to the gap, and the light fell in fragments across what lay beyond. A small room, barely a room. A stone cell set into the thickness of the north wall, no wider than 3 paces, and no deeper than 2. A plank floor laid over the flags, a stool, a narrow writing desk with a slanted top, close set against the far wall. On the desk a tin lamp, twin to the one above, its wick trimmed. Beside the lamp an inkstand, dry. Beside the inkstand, a small oak strongbox banded in iron, no larger than a family Bible. Elizabeth eased herself through the gap. The air smelled of paper and cold iron, and the faint sweet ghost of pipe tobacco. She set the lantern on the desk and stood a long moment before she touched anything. Then she opened the strongbox with the rusted iron key from her pocket, and the key turned as though the lock had been oiled that week. Inside lay letters. They were tied in bundles of 12 with plain string, each bundle labeled in her father's neat slanting hand with a year. She counted the bundles. 11. The topmost letter of the topmost bundle bore her name, Elizabeth, written in the same hand, and beneath the name a date 3 weeks before his death. Under the letters lay a folded sheet of heavier paper, stamped with a red seal, and under the sheet lay the brown cloth ledger's twin, thicker, kept in the same slanting script. She lifted the sealed sheet to the lantern. It was a receipt of settlement, drawn up in Merrifield, and signed by 2 witnesses, showing that the sum owed to Bramwell of Merrifield had been paid in full 4 years earlier. She read it twice, then a third time. Then she sat down on the stool, because her knees would not hold her. She did not open the letters yet. She held the topmost one between her hands, and pressed the flat of her thumb against her name, and understood, in the small pause between one breath and the next, why her father had kept the tower, and why he had lit the lamp every night, and why he had told Mr. Harrow the key was for no one but her. The wind rose that afternoon out of the west. Elizabeth heard it first as a low note in the upper courses, the same note she had heard on her first night, but climbing. She had meant to sit with the letters until dusk. She closed the strong box instead, and pushed it back into the cell, and set 2 of the loose stones over the opening to keep the cat from wandering in. By the time she stepped into the yard, the sky above the ridge had gone the color of slate, and the rooks were down out of the elms and low along the hedgerows. The storm came on before the light went. Rain first, hard and flat. Then hail that struck the flagstones and bounced. Elizabeth got the axe and the barrow inside, and set the door against the wind, and drew the iron bolt. The tower took the weather, as it had taken the weather for 200 years. Water ran down the channel behind her head, and out under the sill. A stone in the upper courses shifted, and settled with a dry click. Then, between 2 gusts, she heard a voice on the lane. Not a call, a cry, thin, torn sideways by the wind. Elizabeth drew back the bolt and put her shoulder to the door. Mrs. Ainsley stood in the lane below the tower, with her oilskin hood blown back and her basket gone. She had a child with her, a boy of 6 or 7, in a soaked coat, clutched against her hip. Behind her, the hedgerow bent flat under the wind. She had come up from the low end of the parish, she said later, because the boy's mother was down with fever, and the roof of their cottage had lifted at the corner, and the rain was falling through the room where the child slept. and she had thought the tower was nearest, and the tower was stone. Elizabeth went down the slope into the wet, and took the boy from her, and carried him inside. Mrs. Ainsley came after, one hand along the wall. Elizabeth set the boy on the cot, and drew the blanket over him, and fed the stove with the last of the split wood she had cut that morning. She gave Mrs. Ainsley the chair. She heated rainwater in the tin cup, and put it into the old woman's hands. The cat climbed onto the cot, and pressed itself against the boy's back, and did not move. The storm ran through the night. Elizabeth did not sleep. She stood by the stove and fed it in small pieces, listening to the wind and the boy's slow breathing, and the rasp of Mrs. Ainsley's chest. Twice she went up the stair, and looked from the upper window, and saw no lamp anywhere in the parish, only black rain. Once she went to the north wall, and put her hand on the stone above the two loose blocks, and thought of the letters her father had written her every month for 11 years, and had never sent. She thought of the settled debt. She thought of Mr. Bramwell in his broad coat, saying a key to a ruin was not the same. She thought of the boy on the cot. She did not weep. She banked the stove and drew her cloak closer, and stayed at her post. Toward the small hours the wind fell. Elizabeth stood at the door, and drew the bolt back, and opened it a hand's breadth on the wet dark. The rain had thinned. Somewhere down in the village, a dog barked once. She closed the door, and turned back into the room where the woman and the child and the cat all slept in the low red light of the stove. And she knew, without saying it, that she would not sell the tower, not for coin, not for the settling of rates, not for a coach south, not for any offer any man in Pine Hollow or Merrifield could put into her hand. Morning came gray and washed clean. Elizabeth opened the door onto a lane strewn with fallen twigs and a hedgerow silvered with rain. Mrs. Ainsley slept in the chair with her hands folded. The boy stirred under the blanket with the cat still against his back. Word had already gone down the ridge before Elizabeth heard the first boots on the gravel. A woman from the low cottages came up with a shawl over her head and a covered pot in her hands, saying only that the boy's mother was mending and asking after the child. She saw him breathing on the cot and set the pot on the table without a word about the tower or the ivy or the fallen upper courses. Behind her came Mr. Pendry with a second load of split wood, and behind him 2 men Elizabeth did not know, one carrying a length of sound timber on his shoulder for the lifted cottage roof at the low end of the parish. They looked at her, and at the swept flag floor, and at the stove burning steady, and touched their caps. By midday, a small line of people had come up the lane. None laughed. The woman from the pump, who had not greeted Elizabeth on the first night, brought a wrapped loaf, and stood in the door, a long moment, looking at the cot, before setting it on the shelf, beside the tin plates. A boy from the vestry brought a paper from the clerk, a receipt for the part payment of the rates, written in a neater hand than the sum deserved. Mrs. Ainsley, waking, drank her cup of warmed water, and told the room quietly that the tower had held. No one answered. No one needed to. That afternoon, Mr. Harrow came up the ridge himself in his gray coat, with a leather case under his arm. Elizabeth showed him the cell behind the 2 loose stones. He looked at the desk and the tin lamp, and lifted the sealed sheet from the strongbox with the care of a man who had waited a long time to see it. He read it once through. He set it down and said, quietly, "Your father was a careful man. He said the debt in Merrifield had been settled 4 years, and any claim now put forward against the estate on that account would not stand in any court he knew. He said the tower and its 3 acres were hers, entire, unencumbered beyond the small rates, and that he would be pleased to enter the receipt on the parish record himself, before Sunday." He closed the strongbox with both hands. At the door he paused, looked once up the ivy, and said, "He kept it swept." Then he went down the lane. Mr. Bramwell came on the following day, without lantern-bearers and without his broad belted coat, wearing instead a plainer wool that showed the stoop in his shoulders. He stood at the door and did not step inside. He said he had heard about the boy. He said he had heard about the receipt. He said his brother in Merrifield had grown forgetful in the matter of ledgers, and that he himself had spoken too hard on a wet night to a young woman lately off a coach. He did not ask to buy the tower. Elizabeth said, "The wind came hard off the ridge." Mr. Bramwell almost smiled. He touched his hat and went down between the hedgerows, and the chorus at the pump, watching him pass, said nothing at all. By the end of the week, the letters lay in their 11 bundles on the plain wooden table, and Elizabeth had read the first 3. The lamp burned again in the upper window every night. Villagers walking home saw it and did not look away. On the 7th evening, the sky cleared to a long, slow gold above the ridge. Elizabeth stood in the open door, with the cat at her ankle, and Mrs. Ainsley beside her, leaning on the jamb. The elms held the last light. The rooks came in. Mr. Pendry, passing below with an empty barrow, raised a hand, and Elizabeth raised hers. Mrs. Ainsley asked, softly, what she had made of it all. Elizabeth looked at the tower behind her, and the lane in front of her, and the parish spread out under the gold, and she said, "He did not leave me a ruin. He left me a place to stand. Thank you for staying through the rain and the long climb to the ridge with us." This one was about the quiet inheritances that outlast every offer of coin. If it warmed you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for the next story of a widowed seamstress and a locked cedar chest no one in her village would open.